It's pretty wild to think about. But sometimes a single moment, one debate, one single vote, can literally set the course for an entire organization for 100 years. A choice made in just one room can ripple out through generations, defining not just how things are run, but what the institution itself really values. Today, we're going to dive deep into one of those moments.
So this is the big question we're tackling. We're going to unpack how a huge debate about power, about structure, and about fundamental principles, a debate that happened right at the dawn of the 20th century, ended up creating the reality that a global church is still living in right now.
All right, to really get to the heart of this story, we'll walk through it in 6 key parts. We're going to start with a crisis that brought the church to a major crossroads. Then, we'll look at the radical plan that was put on the table in 1901. From there, we'll see the clash of leadership styles this whole thing created, and then witness the dramatic vote in 1903 that basically flipped everything on its head. And finally, we'll explore the incredibly profound reaction to that vote and trace its echoes right up to the present day.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture it. It's the turn of the 20th century. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, which had started out as this small kind of niche movement in the northeastern United States, had absolutely exploded. It was suddenly a global thing with work happening on every single continent. But the problem was, its structure, the way it was organized, was built for a much smaller church. And now it was cracking under the pressure of all this incredible worldwide growth.
So, when all the delegates got together in 1901, this was not just another meeting. This was a critical moment. The entire foundation of how the church operated was up for grabs. Everybody in that room knew something had to change, but the big question was, what and how?
The answer that came forward wasn't some minor tweak. Oh no. It was a proposal to completely rethink the church's entire operating system. The idea was to move away from what had become a really centralized, top-down kind of structure. And this quote right here from Ellen White, one of the church's co-founders and an incredibly influential voice. She said this at that very session. It just perfectly captures the revolutionary feel of that moment. She wasn't asking for a new committee or shuffling a few people around. She was calling for a brand new foundation, built on a totally different principle.
So what was this different principle? Well, it was decentralization. The idea was simple but radical. Stop forcing people to send messages thousands of miles away just to get advice, and then wait weeks for an answer. The vision was to empower the local leaders, the people who were actually on the ground, to make the decisions that made sense for their own communities. The belief was that the Holy Spirit could guide someone in Australia or Europe just as well as someone in America.
Now, what's so amazing here is how this council just flies in the face of what you'd expect. The normal human instinct for any growing organization is to centralize, right? To create one big powerhouse at the top. But the advice given here was the total opposite. A single global governing body was, and I quote, not in God's order.
Now, this whole debate over structure wasn't really about logistics or efficiency. At its heart, it was a massive clash between 2 completely different philosophies of leadership and power. One was seen as coming from heaven, and the other was seen as a copy of how the world, corporations, governments did things.
And this table just lays it out perfectly. On one side, you've got heaven's model. It's a flat structure. Leaders are servants, authority is local, and everyone is considered a brother or sister, totally on equal footing. Then you look at the other side, the world's model. It's a hierarchy that exercises dominion, with some mastermind at the top calling all the shots. So the choice between decentralization and centralization, it was really a choice between these 2 columns. A choice that, frankly, all kinds of organizations are still wrestling with today.
Now, even though the 1901 session made some moves towards decentralization, like creating what they called union conferences, these new principles never really took hold. So by the time the next big session came around in 1903, a whole new constitution was being proposed. And a lot of people were terrified that it wouldn't just stop the progress from 1901, but completely throw it in reverse.
The opposition was intense, and they drew on some serious history. Professor Percy McGann, a really respected educator, stood up in front of everyone and gave this absolutely chilling warning. He argued that the principles of centralized control being proposed were the exact same principles that led to the formation of the papacy centuries before. Now, for his Protestant audience, that was a huge deal. It was like a giant red flag, a deeply alarming comparison to a system they saw as the ultimate symbol of top-down hierarchical power.
But, of course, the push for centralization had its champions too.
Elder George Butler, a respected former president of the General Conference, he voiced the other side. From his perspective, the old system of central authority wasn't dangerous at all. It was familiar, it was tested, it was safe. He was basically the voice of experience saying, hey, the old ways work. Why are we trying to make such a radical change?
So the battle lines were drawn. You had these two completely different futures on the table. On one side, a call for a decentralized, servant-led church, and on the other, a defense of a centralized structure that felt familiar and safe. The entire future of the church's governance was hanging in the balance as those delegates prepared to vote.
The result? Wow. It was a landslide. It wasn't even close. By a margin of more than 4-1, the delegates voted for the new constitution. 85 voted for centralization, and only 20 held out against it. And in that moment, the vision of 1901 was officially over. The church had made its choice.
But the story definitely does not end with the vote count. We have to look at the profound spiritual impact of this decision. Because for some, this outcome wasn't just a political defeat. It was a spiritual catastrophe.
This might just be one of the most shocking statements in the church's entire history. I mean, think about it. Coming from Ellen White, who had lived through the crushing Great Disappointment of 1844, the massive conflicts of the 1888 conference, for her to call the 1903 decision the greatest, the most terrible sorrow of my life, it just shows you the immense gravity of what she believed had just taken place.
And here's the crucial thing to understand. This sorrow wasn't about losing a vote. It was about watching the church, as she saw it, actively choose to model its own government on worldly policy, that hierarchical, kingly power model, instead of the servant-led, decentralized plan that had been presented as God's will just 2 years earlier.
That vote in 1903 wasn't just some temporary detour. It was a foundational decision that would define the church's administrative DNA for the next 100 years and beyond. It created echoes that are absolutely still being felt today.
So let's break down the long-term consequences. First, that vote cemented a top-down hierarchical structure that, let's be honest, is still largely in place today. It also embedded what its opponents called the principles of worldly policy right into the church's operating manual. And that, in turn, has influenced how things are run at every level, from the world headquarters all the way down to your local church board. The radical, decentralized vision of 1901, it was almost completely set aside. And maybe most importantly, it created a system where leaders often felt their main responsibility was to a committee of people rather than directly to Christ.
This final quote from her writings about the new structure leaves absolutely no room for doubt. The adoption of this model wasn't seen as just a simple preference for how to organize things. It was seen as a spiritual detour, a direct move away from heaven's principles and toward the methods of the world.
And all of this brings us right back to our opening question. When you look at a story like this, a moment in time where two completely different visions were laid out so clearly, it forces us to ask, what do we do with this information? Is it enough to just be a passive bystander to our own history? Or does understanding these pivotal moments actually challenge us to investigate how these century-old decisions are affecting our church and our lives right now? For better or for worse, the echoes of 1903 are all around us. The only question is whether we're willing to listen to them.